Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, J.P. Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 86, The Emergence of Lithuania. So last time I said we were switching to a weekly schedule, and then I immediately caught a cold and lost my voice. But now we're back, and hopefully on a smooth run through to the end of the year. Thank you to new boyars, Diane and Goran, to Tsar Mohammed for his continuing support, Jorgen and David, and to all the subscribers through Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your support is much appreciated. We covered the initial appearance of Lithuania back in episode 64, Mindaugas, the one and only. This episode is going to be a look at the period between the death of Mindaugas and the succession of Gediminas, who will found Lithuania's first ruling dynasty, and is approximately contemporary to Ivan Kalita and Ozbek Khan. To avoid getting bogged down, we're going to cover this period in fairly broad strokes. If you recall, Mindaugas had officially converted to Christianity as part of resisting the Teutonic Knights, and had begun trying to create a centralized Lithuanian state. And both of these things trod on the toes of the old tribal nobility. This led to his assassination in late 1263 at a hill fort in eastern Lithuania, plunging the emerging kingdom back into political turbulence. The assassins were led by Treniota, Mindaugas' nephew, son of Vykintas, a duke from the Samogitian region of western Lithuania. Samogitia, or Žemaitija, was a lowland region watered by the Dubisa, Jura, and Nevizis, characterized by dense pine forest, bogs, and tribes committed to their traditional pagan beliefs. Perkunas, the god of thunder, and Medeina, the goddess of the forest, were worshipped in sacred groves, and German missionaries were fiercely resisted. Vykintas, who is believed to have been the brother of Mindaugas' wife Morta, had been his key ally against the Teutonic Knights and in subduing other Baltic tribes. But they had fallen out over Christianity and claims for the king's authority over the dukes. He was joined in the conspiracy by Domantas, Duke of Nalshia in the northeastern region, which bordered on Polotsk and the Livonian territories of the Sword Brethren, a strategic position on the trade routes between the Western Rus Kняжества and the Baltic. Together with Augštaitija, Žemaitija, Deltuva, and Neris, Nalshia was one of the 5 core zemes, or lands, from which Lithuania emerged. Like Vykintas, Daumantas had been an early supporter of Mindaugas, who became disaffected over Christianity and encroachment on his personal authority. Mindaugas had apostatized around 1261 in an attempt to head off the discontent, but had not abandoned his efforts to impose his authority on the dukes. So the conspirators ambushed and slew Mindaugas and his sons in 1263, declaring their rejection of Christianity and a centralized monarchy. Between 1263 and Gediminus' accession in around 1315, despite ducal rivalries, political instability, and the ongoing Northern Crusades, Lithuania will transition from a tribal confederacy to a centralized polity, conquering and annexing Black Rus and Polotsk to result in what is effectively a multi-ethnic empire with a Slavic Orthodox majority, forming the basis for the Gediminid dynasty to expand from the Baltic to the Black Sea, creating medieval Europe's largest political entity. In the aftermath of the conspiracy, Treniote assumed leadership. Our main sources are written by the Teutonic Order, and they treat the assassins as devil worshippers, with Treniote a cunning anti-Christian villain who drove out missionaries and burned churches. He was unable to achieve general recognition and was himself assassinated within a year by Mindaugas' eldest son, who had been away and had survived. Vaishvilkas, or Wojciech, had spent years in Polotsk and Galicia, where he had firmly embraced orthodoxy. He took the throne in 1264 and pursued Rus alliances, especially with Galicia-Volhynia, but he emphasized reconciliation and did not attempt to convert the Lithuanian nobles. He abdicated in 1267 to become a monk and gave the throne to his brother-in-law, Shvan, son of Daniel of Galicia. Shvan was unable to consolidate his position, although the chronicles are inconsistent and confusing, putting his death in 1269 down to natural causes, poison, or battle wounds, depending on which one you're reading. Meanwhile, Shvan's brother, Lev Danilovich, who ruled Galicia from 1264 to 1301, killed Vaishvilkas in a dispute over Volhynian territory. Shvan was succeeded by Traidenis, who successfully managed to consolidate the duchies. He fought the Teutonic Knights in the area around what is now Kaliningrad and built hill forts on the border rivers. He married his daughter to the son of Duke Boleslav II of Mazovia, securing ties with Poland, and concluded an agreement with the Hanseatic city of Riga. He completed the annexation of Black Rus in what is now southwestern Belarus, including Grodno, Novokhrudsk, Minsk, and Turovpinsk. This led to the adoption of Rus and Orthodox practices, including monastic record-keeping, written charters for land ownership, and the recognition of the knyazes as semi-autonomous local rulers. He did not try to impose Lithuanian linguistic or cultural dominance on the Slavic Orthodox populations being annexed. The Lithuanians position themselves as alternative protectors or overlords to Rus knyazes that were vulnerable to attacks by Mongols and Teutonic Knights. Early aggressive expansion gave way to more amicable acquisitions over time. In the traditional narrative, a symbiosis formed in which the Lithuanians provided military power, while the Rus brought culture, law, orthodoxy, and the clerical bureaucracy. As Lithuanian paganism did not require the conversion of their Rus subjects, they were able to tolerate orthodoxy, although Rus chronicles tend to refer to them in various derogatory terms for unbelievers whenever conflicts arose. Relations were not always smooth. The Teutonic chronicles continue to report on Lithuanian raids into Rus territory and describe the Lithuanians treating the Rus with arrogance, while the Galician-Volhynian chronicle records betrayals by their Lithuanian allies. Of course, the Teutonic chronicles were written by their enemies, and the Rus chronicles, as we well know, were rewritten for ideological purposes, so take all that with a grain of salt. The period following Traidenis is extremely poorly documented. He appears to have been succeeded by Daumantas, who is only mentioned once in the chronicles, leading an attack on the Alieschnia Volust of the Kняжество of Tver in 1285. We do not even know where Alieschnia was, and the Rus chronicles suggest that Daumantas was either killed or captured. Daumantas was succeeded by Butigeidis, generally considered to be the first of the Gediminids. He was likely the son of Traidenis, although we do not have direct evidence of the relationships between Traidenis, Daumantas, and Butigeidis. His brief reign saw an escalation in the Northern Crusades, which we will catch up on in the next episode, and a peace treaty with Volhynia. Butigeidis may have shared power with a brother, Butvidas. The Galician-Volhynian chronicle has them concluding the peace treaty together, and we have a couple of other instances of co-rulership in Lithuania later. Although we have next to no records for his or their reign, some historians have argued that the administrative foundations for Lithuania were created during this period, which enabled the centralization and expansion of Lithuania under his successors. Butvidas was succeeded by his son, Vytenis, who ruled for almost 20 years and really laid the foundations for the dynasty and became the first significant Grand Duke of Lithuania. Although for modern historians his reputation has been eclipsed by his brother Gediminas, who gave his name to the dynasty, this took quite a while, and for contemporaries, Vytenis was seen as the greater. He faced almost constant warfare as the Teutonic Knights intensified their efforts to conquer the entire Baltic coast. Besides almost constant military attacks, the Knights also tried to get Lithuanian nobles to change sides by threats or bribery. Vytenis worked against them by building a network of defensive castles. In many places, the rivers that marked the boundaries between territories would end up with a Lithuanian castle on one side and a Teutonic castle on the other. Over his 19-year reign, the Teutonic Knights invaded Lithuanian territory 20 times, and the Lithuanians invaded the Knights' territory 11 times. In 1297, disagreements between the Archbishop of Riga and the Livonian Order developed into a full-blown war, and Vytenis successfully concluded an alliance with the city and conducted several campaigns against the order. In 1307, he completed the annexation of all the territories of Polotsk, which had mostly been under Lithuanian influence for a couple of decades. The increase of Orthodox Slav subjects, which were now becoming a clear majority in Lithuania, led to a conundrum. As Lithuania annexed more Rus, or Ruthenian as they're usually called, territories, it became clear that they would be developing a rivalry with the northeastern Knyazhstva. And these territories fell under the ecclesiastical authority of the Metropolitan of Kiev, who had thrown in his lot with Moscow. The obvious move was for Lithuania to claim its own metropolitanate, which would require the authorization of Constantinople. Although records are again missing, it is likely that Vytenis took the first steps towards achieving this. Although there is a record of Vytenis having at least one son, named Žvelgutis, he appears to have died before his father. Vytenis' own death is not recorded, but he did not have an heir. As a result, he was succeeded by his brother, Gediminas, under whom Lithuania will become the leading military and political power in Eastern Europe. Lithuanian rule over Rus and Ruthenian territories gives us some of the thorniest and most controversial Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Lithuanian historiographical questions. In the Russian imperial historiography of the 19th century, represented by historians such as Nikolai Kostomarov, a pan-Slavist romantic born in Ukraine, and Mikhail Koyalovich, a theologian and historian born in Belarus, who saw orthodoxy as the basis of Russian identity, Lithuania was a primitive and barbaric tribal society, isolated by its boggy forest motherland. The Northern Crusades and the Mongol invasions forced the Lithuanians into unification with the superior Rus civilization, which gave them administration, law, and religion. This unification created a polyethnic state in which Orthodox Slavs dominated Baltic pagans, a state that was more Russian than Lithuanian, and which maintained the brotherly unity of the Eastern Slavs. As Ukrainians developed their own historical narrative in the 19th century, especially through the work of Mikhailo Hrushevsky, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was treated as a critical link between Rus and Ukrainian statehood. In this narrative, Galicia-Volhynia is the successor to Kiev. Hrushevsky does not regard the northeastern Knyazhstva as Rus at all, and Lithuania's absorption of the southwestern Knyazhstva preserves and continues Rus traditions. The idea of Lithuanian conquest is rejected in favor of a symbiotic process in which pagan Lithuanians adopt Rus Orthodox culture, law, and administrative practices to create a Lithuanian Rus entity that is essentially Rus in character. Vilnius, Lithuania's new capital, is the center of Rus heritage after the decline of Kiev, and the Gediminids are custodians of the emerging Ukrainian identity against their Polish and Muscovite enemies. Lithuania's relations with the Rus Knyazhstva are treated as voluntary unions or the result of dynastic marriages, and there is no Lithuanian dominance. Ukrainian elites are autonomous and influential. Essentially, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania is a transitional phase in Ukrainian development between the old Rus and the Cossack revolts. However, full integration is prevented by Lithuanians' adherence to pagan practices. Belarusian historians take a different viewpoint. For them, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania is the foundational element in Belarusian statehood, representing a unification of Proto-Belarusian Kняжество and the Baltic peoples, centered on Novokhrudyak. Post-Soviet state textbooks, such as the editions produced by Bokhan and Shtykhov in 2009 to 2010, depict the Belarusian territories as the core of a multi-ethnic Grand Duchy, fostering tolerance and with the Slavonic written language used for its official documents, referred to as Old Belarusian. Integration with Polotsk and other Rus Kняжества is seen as a peaceful process that blended Orthodox and Lithuanian traditions, with Belarusians serving as a bridge between East and West. The official narrative links this through to the Soviet era, with the Grand Duchy forming a model for tolerance and multi-ethnic harmony. In contrast to this official narrative, Belarusian nationalists have claimed that the Grand Duchy is essentially Belarusian, even claiming Gediminas and other leaders as Belarusians rather than Lithuanians, seeing it as an independent Belarusian state tied into Western European traditions, rather than a multi-ethnic or linked to Eastern European and the Soviet Union. After listening to these arguments for Slavic supremacy and Baltic barbarism, you probably won't be surprised to hear that many Lithuanian scholars reject the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian narratives. Lithuanian historians found little opportunity to speak up during the Soviet occupation, but in the post-Soviet era, historians like Edvardas Gudavičius, Alfredas Bumblauskas, and Zenonas Norkus have criticized all these narratives for nationalist biases that emphasize Slavic dominance, voluntary integration, and shared ownership, while erasing the Lithuanian core, the Grand Duchy, Lithuanian agency, and the duchy's imperial characteristics. The notion of Lithuania as a primitive entity civilized by superior Rus elements, as presented in the traditional Russian imperial narrative, is rejected as serving Tsarist policies aimed at suppressing Belarusian national consciousness and promoting the idea of the single greater Russian nation, and the Soviet narrative, the Grand Duchy, as a feudal precursor to Russian dominance. While Lithuanian historians accept that some Rus territories did join the Grand Duchy peacefully and voluntarily, they argue that this was a consequence of Lithuania's military successes and aggressive expansion elsewhere, making acceptance of Lithuanian overlordship a better choice than resistance, not because primitive Lithuanians were accepting guidance from superior Slavs. The Ukrainian historiography following Khrushchevsky and the depiction of the Grand Duchy as a Lithuanian Rus entity preserving the continuity of Ukrainian statehood from Rus to the Cossacks, is criticized by Lithuanians for erasing Lithuanian agency overemphasizing voluntary unions and marginalizing Baltic contributions. Gudavicius and Norkus argued that the integration of territories that would form the future Ukraine, like Volhynia and Kiev, came through Lithuanian conquest and dynastic control, not equal partnership, and that Hrushevsky's arguments play to nationalist claims of Vilnius as a Rus city. Overall, Lithuanian historians argue for a Grand Duchy dominated by the Lithuanian elite, following a pathway of imperial expansion. Ukrainian and Belarusian territories are treated as appanages, sometimes as peripheral, and they argue against allowing the depiction of a multi-ethnic polity to drift into Slavic narratives, nationalizing the Grand Duchy in their favor. This emphasis does not mean that Lithuanian scholars reject the key role of the Grand Duchy in the emergence of Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian identities. On the contrary, they see it as the decisive factor in Rus not giving rise to a single Slavic identity. Zionas Norkus, who argues strongly for conceptualizing the Grand Duchy of Lithuania as an undeclared empire, asserts that in contrast to most empires, stereotypically the prison house of nations, Lithuania was the cradle of these Eastern European nations. Lithuanians have had the sharpest critiques for Belarusian narratives that try to claim the Grand Duchy for Belarus. In contrast to Belarusian arguments that the duchy centered on Novohrudak in Belarus, Gudavicius has argued that the center was always in the Lithuanian territories. The elites were always Lithuanian-speaking, and pagans and Catholics dominated the Orthodox population. Since the 1980s, there's been a pseudo-historical nationalist movement called Litvinism, which claims that Belarusians are the historical Litva, the word used in the chronicles and in modern Russian for Lithuania, while modern Lithuanians are Lietuva, descendants of the Samogitians and therefore representatives of only one of the tribes of Lithuania. Although this has remained marginal, it has caused controversy in the context of competing territorial claims after the fall of the Soviet Union, and has caused concern for Lithuanians, who are understandably made nervous by claims that undermine their legitimacy. Since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, figures such as the notorious Russian fascist Alexander Dugin have taken up Litvinism, and an organization purporting to preserve the identity of Belarusians living in Lithuania has been established. The Lithuanian government has seen this as part of Russian information warfare, and has taken steps to counter it with their own programs. In the West, the traditional historiography has been closer to the Lithuanian position, as the Slavic nations' need to legitimate themselves through historical claims is not usually a major consideration. The Grand Duchy is seen as originating with the Lithuanians, emerging through Lithuanian expansionism, and remaining dominated by a Lithuanian-speaking elite, irrespective of the use of Slavonic written language and its majority Orthodox Slavic population. However, some scholars have been influenced by Russian or Ukrainian narratives, such as treating the Russian acquisition of Belarus as the restoration of Russian lands, or the well-known American historian Timothy Snyder, who leans quite heavily into the Ukrainian nationalist approach to the Grand Duchy in his The Making of Modern Ukraine lecture series on YouTube. From this historiographical summary, it's not hard to see that the Grand Duchy of Lithuania raises questions that continue to be highly relevant today. We will be returning to all these themes, which are extremely important to the emergence of Lithuanian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian identities, as well as Russian imperialism, throughout this podcast. And if you're feeling a bit confused about what Rus, Ruthenian, and Russian mean, and how they relate to each other, don't worry about it for now. I'm going to dedicate some time soon to looking at what we know about Slavic identities in the aftermath of the Mongol conquests and the decline of Kiev. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.